conservationist movement. It wasn't even that really, it was more companions on the trail. The Sierra Club was more of a hiking club. Brower was trying to change it.
There's a lot to be said for Dave Brower as a catalyst for so many things.
He had a plate full of dams and forests being cut down and wilderness places being overrun, and he wanted to fight all those battles.
I don't recall any kind of phraseology, terminology that we applied to ourselves. We were just this bunch of people who were battling PG&E because we didn't think there should be a nuclear plant on the San Andreas Fault.
And we had a meeting of the then what were considered conservationists. The word environmentalist didn't exist. I think it was David Brower said there probably should be a new organization. So we figured we were the somebodies.
From arguably Teddy Roosevelt through the Wilderness Act 1964, the environmental movement in this country was conservative, very much so. David Brower in 1960 voted for Nixon.
It was literally conserving. It was conservation. The two keywords of environmentalist and ecologist are latecomers compared to conservation.
The ecological context was definitely present in that movement already then.
We developed a pretty fine-tuned consciousness about where we were in the late 60s. You can't take acid and not realize that you're part of the place where you are.
People like Alan Watts and so on were throwing out ideas that made us all think that it's not just about how you think, but it's how your thinking and sensibility relates to the natural world. In the context, for example, of the war at the time, there were lots of things that were wrong in the world, and one of the things that it turned out was wrong was our relationship to nature.
All sorts of just messed up stories from people about what was going on in Vietnam, and it was an easy jump from there with the Passaic River burning and the smog issues and things that you were learning about nuclear weapons, to start to think that, well, there are these bigger pictures.
We were into living in a more harmonious way with the planet right from the mid-60s. I mean, there was natural medicine, there was natural childbirth, there was organic foods, and there was sustainable living, essentially.
A poet named Alan van Newkirk had been using the word bioregion. He described a way of seeing natural areas on the planet that had been developed by Raymond F. Dassman. He had written The Destruction of California, based on his experience in World War II, where he had seen big machines, DCATs, used to make airfields, and then brought back to the US and used to knock down forests. And Ray was a bona fide world-class ecologist. He had worked for the World Wildlife Fund and had developed a series of maps called Biotic Provinces of the World. And I just wrote directly to Ray and said, I like your ideas a lot. Why don't we put people in it and make a movement out of it that would be socio-political? And Ray wrote back and said, that's exactly what needs to be done.
There was a lot of Native American input into the hippie era, and that was very land-based. The Native Americans are the people that lived the longest in this North America, and we felt we had a lot to learn from the way they lived here.
If you think of 1972, this is when some of the major legislation happened in the Nixon administration: Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, National Environmental Policy Act. And there wasn't this sense that the environment was a lefty issue as much. So many groups started right at that point of the late 60s. Friends of the Earth, Natural Resources Defense Council, Environmental Defense. So much happened right around that interesting point.
I think the environment movement as an interesting, engaging thing ended with the founding of Earth Day and the EPA. So since 1972, if you've been an honest person in regard to your identity within the biosphere, you really wouldn't want to be involved with those ends. That there was a whole other area, huge area, of redefinition to harmonize with natural systems rather than to protect or defend or whatever.
The folks who founded Greenpeace understood the interconnection between the environment, war and peace, and the media, and presenting an image. And that was fascinating stuff at the time.
People who were there back in the early days were very grounded in a social justice perspective. It wasn't just working on the environment. The founders really were civil rights activists and had a very deep belief in the environment as a civil right, and did serious science to evaluate who was getting the brunt of the pollution.
The things that are impacting our work right now is everything from the Black Panthers and civil rights movements in the 50s and 60s to the free speech movement and really early conservation groups. Like, all that stuff kind of comes together.
The biggest change from environmentalist politics to ecological politics for me is the difference between protest and proactive approaches. And it's finally coming on, which is to readapt human activities to the realities of natural systems and bioregions.
In the mid-70s, Richard Register and the others at Urban Ecology had begun to articulate their version of nature in the cities. I think there's a great deal of attention now to the quality of green space inside of cities, and I think that's only going to increase.
I never really followed any of the mainstream environmental organizations. I think because most of my political outlook is couched in the terms of local grassroots, person-to-person activism.
I love to go backpacking, and I love to hang out in the wilderness, and I love hanging out here in the garden 3 days a week. And I have this sort of like innate biophilia that I think drives a lot of environmental activists. But emotionally and intellectually, I do ecological activism as a social justice campaign, as a social justice crusade.
I wasn't interested in conservation just for conservation's sake, and much more interested in the way that the systems that we're operating in, that are in place currently today, ensure that some people bear more of a burden for environmental problems than others.
Organizationally, we're pushing ourselves and pushing our allies of, like, you have to move beyond just saying, oh, we want equity, we want justice. Helpful, but not enough. And that if we can't really articulate what does that actually mean and how do you realize it, then I don't feel like we're in a position to be able to say to the MTCs or other decision makers, city council, the mayor, we want you to fix XYZ problem if we don't know what the solutions are.
I've long been cognizant that, you know, for the environmental movement to succeed, or for any movement to succeed, you need a broad range of screamers, shouters, compromisers, lawyers, organizers, writers, etc. You need all hands on deck.
There's a certain ecology to the environmental movement where we have certain niches to occupy. I think we can all be better at working on a more common strategy, but I also think sometimes there is a role for groups to just be way out ahead.